Hello everyone and welcome back to the good stuff. We are back at the Capablanca saga, which means we are back at the 1918 tournament of New York, where Capablanca will for the second time face his old rival Frank James Marshall. In the first round of the tournament he already defeated him. It was the famous game that we already shown. If you haven't seen it, really a brilliant game, the one where Marshall employs the martial attack for the first time. If you haven't, do check it out. It will be the first link in the description below. If you have, then just enjoy the rest of the rest of the tournament. Capablanca still undefeated in this tournament. This is already round 8, so he already played against everyone. Now he's going to play against everyone once again, as it is a double round robin. And all victories so far for Capablanca, only one draw in round 3 against Roy Turnbull Black, it's just you know, a nice clean tournament for Capablanca. So without further ado, let's check it out. And this is really an amazing game. I do hope you like the title as well. And as you can see, we've already used this quote several times. In order to improve your game, you must study the end game before everything else. So, you know, whenever I walk down the street, or, you know, I'm enjoying a nice beer or something, and someone asks me how to improve his chess, I just tell them, you know, study the end game. That's what Capablanca said. That's what I think is the correct way to do if you want to improve your game. But without further ado, let's check it out. Marshall has the white pieces and he opens with d4. We have d5, knight to f3, knight to f6, we have c4, and of course, you all know what we're going into. We have e6, the queen's gambit declined. Knight to c3, we have knight b to d7, bishop to g5 by Marshall, bishop to e7, e3 with castles, and rook to c1. This is the most standard line of the queen's gambit decline possible, with c6 and queen to c2. And theory didn't really move from this since this was played, and 100 years since this was played. To give a comparison, in 2016 Wojtaszek played this exact same position against Shahryar Mamedyarov, and the game ended in a draw. So you can see that even players of those days really had a firm grasp of everything, the principles, the openings, the everything. D captures on c4 with bishop captures on c4, and now Capablanca goes for this maneuver, which just allows him to trade a few pieces and then make black's position a little bit easier and hopefully transfer the game into an endgame. With bishop captures on e7, queen captures on e7, and here Marshall castles. Instead of castling, you can also go knight e4 or knight to e2 if you're not interested in allowing black to trade yet another piece. But Marshall doesn't care, he just castles. We have knight captures on c3 by Capablanca, not b captures, although it is a more principled move. We have queen captures on c3 by Marshall, and now just b6, preparing to fianchetto the light square bishop. We have e4 by Marshall, preparing e5, and now comes the bishop to b7, and now just rook f to e1. We have rook f to d8 by Capablanca, and now just d5. As Capablanca's queen still remains on the e7 square, it does make sense to push d5. So knight to c5, of course you're not interested in capturing. We have d captures on e6, knight captures on e6, and here a very interesting moment in the game. Marshall can play queen e5. He can just keep the tension, you know, try and improve the position of his pieces, but he actually decides to give up his light square bishop for a knight to win a pawn, even though only temporarily. With bishop captures on e6, queen captures on e6, and now knight to d4. Now, having a triple attack against the c6 pawn, Capablanca doesn't have time to add yet another defender to the pawn, as his queen is under attack, so he has to move. We have queen to e5, knight captures on c6, queen captures on c3, rook captures on c3, and now rook to d2. A very active move by Capablanca, who is for the moment down a pawn, but he's ready to grab that b2 pawn. And here Marshall has an option. He can either go for an active move or he can try to defend his extra pawn. And since he already grabbed a pawn from Capablanca, he wants to defend it. Here he played rook to b1, where there was a possibility to go rook to c1, just to give up the b2 pawn for activity. And after captures, now go knight to e5. You want to go rook c7, you want to go after this pawn, and it's very, very likely that this game would end in a very quick draw. Let's say rook d8, f3 now, defending this pawn, or either you could go, instead of defending rook c7, and allow this rook to d2 move, which would really allow black to go for a quick draw, but you could also go for f3, captures on a2, now comes rook to c7, just going after that pawn, but now h5, a very nice move that again offers a draw. where after captures you can go just rook d to d2, and now you will not be able to get out of check. Check, king h7 captures here, and now after rook captures on g2, king h1 captures here. You will constantly be able to keep checking the white king, even though you're down a piece, doesn't really matter. So this is one of the possibilities that Marshall had, but maybe he just wasn't interested in a draw against Capablanca with the white pieces, especially after that game he lost to Capablanca in round 1, which was just insane. If you haven't seen it, it's the first link in the description below, just a wild game. Rook to b1, Marshall says, I grab the pawn, I'm gonna defend it. But here Capablanca goes rook to e8. Now pressures this pawn, and you have to decide how to defend it. If you go f3, then f5, you're not really going to keep your intact pawn structure here. So Marshall decides to go for e5. And now there's a problem. You always have to keep an eye on this bishop captures and just rook captures on e5. But for the moment it's not possible, as there are some back rank weaknesses for Capablanca. So he deals with both of Marshall's ideas with one move, with g5, now freeing some space for the king, so Capablanca gets rid of all the back rank weaknesses, and also he doesn't allow f4, which would allow Marshall to consolidate in the center. So Marshall goes h4, he decides to give up one pawn to allow him to play f4 at some point, but also to just mess up Capablanca's pawn structure. Capablanca says, thank you for the pawn, this idea is really bad. We have g captures on h4, and now Marshall has some problems. If he goes for f4, maybe as planned, king h8, and now you're not really going to have a lot of fun defending this g2 pawn. And on the other hand, after g captures on h4, if you play something like knight captures here, just rook captures on e5, and now rook g5 is again coming to g2, bishop piling up on that g2 pawn. Not a lot you can do here. So here Marshall realizes that it's not really possible to play something like this. He decides to go for rook to e1. He says, okay, you just grab a pawn, I'm just gonna consolidate here, you know. But Capablanca is not interested. Here Capablanca goes rook to e6. He says, okay, I do a nice rook lift with a double attack against your knight, but also I'm ready to go rook to g6 at some point to pressure your g2 pawn. We have rook e to c1 now. Finally, Marshall doubles up on the c file. So as you can see, Capablanca is really playing amazing chess here, as Marshall was, well, not forced, but first he went rook b1, then on the second move he went rook e1, then he went rook c1, not really achieving anything in the position, and well, it's all due to Capablanca's insane level of play. So okay, for the moment you can't go rook g6 due to knight e7, you will just lose that rook, so Capablanca just goes king to g7. He prepares rook to g6. With b4 by Marshall, and now comes b5, not allowing b5 by white to consolidate with the knight on c6. With a3 by Marshall, now at least his pawns on the queen side are no longer targets, and now we have rook to g6. With king to f1, you have to play some move, but there really isn't a good move to play here. With king to f1, as h3 was a threat, the g2 pawn would have been pinned there, and now Capablanca just goes rook to a2, and this, if you look at it, creates a beautiful Zugzwang, where any move Marshall makes will just be a terrible move. So you can't move this rook. This rook has to keep an eye on the a3 pawn and also on the knight. Same goes for this rook. You can't really move this rook. Both rooks are required to not lose a piece for white. You can't go back with the king. If you go back, just h3. If you go back to the e file, then just rook captures here. The only move you can make, and it's in fact the best defense for white, is this silly e6 move, which either offers to get the rook out of the g file, so you'll no longer have any threats, or f captures on e6, which is a nice clean pawn, but then Marshall is able to play rook to d3 and threaten rook to d7 check, which would win the bishop. Capablanca would go bishop captures on c6 with rook captures on c6, and now rook to a1 check. Force the king out of the defense of the g2 pawn, king e2, and now rook captures on g2. And now it's a very hard position to play for white. Capablanca up material with a very dangerous passed h pawn. Marshall, Marshall of course looked at this move, but he didn't like it. He knew that the endgame was lost against Capablanca. So he tried king to g1. He allows Capablanca this h3 move with h3 by Capablanca, and now g3. Of course you cannot capture, and now comes a6. And it's a really disgusting position to be in for white. With e6 now by Marshall, but now as the rook is no longer needed on the g file, he even captures with the rook. We have rook captures on e6, and now g4 preparing f3. We have rook back to h6, not allowing rook captures on h3, just f3 now, defending the g4 pawn. And now Capablanca just returns. Rook to d6, now the rook is coming to d2, and there is not all that much Marshall can do. We have knight to e7, hoping for knight to f5 check, winning the rook, but Capablanca just goes rook d to d2. We have knight to f5 check, hoping to trick Capablanca one last time. Of course, if king goes here, then you can just give up one rook for checkmate. Captures and checkmate, as the knight is controlling e7 and g7. But Capablanca is, not an easy person to trick. With king to f6, now comes knight to h4. Capablanca just brings the king deeper into the position. King g5 attacks the knight. Marshall has to go back. We have rook to g2 check, king to f1. We have h2, preparing for h1 checkmate. Marshall played f4 check, just, a nice check to end the game. King captures on f4, and it was in this position that Frank James Marshall resigned the game. As well, as you can see, there's nothing you can do here. So look, but it's just beautiful. Of course, h1 queen or a rook just wins the game. There's no defense against this. You can prolong the game by silly moves like rook f3 check, but we're not even going to cover those. So yeah, just a wonderful game by Capablanca with the black pieces against Frank James Marshall. Really, just two beautiful games against Frank James Marshall in this tournament. And it really, all comes down to that moment. Look at this final position. Look at Capablanca's beautiful bishop on b7, completely slicing the board in half. Capablanca's two active rooks. And remember that moment where we mentioned that Marshall could have gone for something like queen to e5, just increasing the pressure, maybe bring the other rook into the game, figure out where to go from there. But he decided to give up his light square bishop, which is basically the only piece able to counter Capablanca's light square bishop for this temporary pawn, as we mentioned, captures, and in the end he wasn't even able to to keep onto this pawn that he so greedily jumped upon. As a rook to d2, just such an active move. I mean, going after b2, rook b1. It seems like I'm just repeating the game we've already seen, but such a decision will cost you the game against a player of Capablanca's caliber. And in the end, after this, now position, this knight here and this beautiful bishop, like we already said, slicing the board in half, just amazing. That's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it, and remember, if you want to improve your game, study the endgame. That's the only way to do it. And then after you reach 24-2500, then you can study openings. Once again, I would like to thank Paul Gibbons and Krzysztof Urbanek for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the Capablanca saga with this 1980 New York tournament. Then we're heading into Capablanca's match against Serbian Grandmaster Bora Kostic, and then we of course go for the World Chess Championship match, Capablanca versus Lasker, that we are preparing for such a long time already. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.